And so we went as an individual and came back as an individual instead of like right now the troops. Most of them are going over as a unit, as their unit that they've either active duty or guard or reserve that they're with all the time.
So there's the camaraderie of the unit supporting our soldiers that come back.
Right.
They all come back as a unit.
And then the local communities support them a lot more than what they did with us.
Now, the units aren't set up regionally, are they? Or are they? Are they coming out of a certain, like Fort Riley?
Well, like Fort Riley,
they're
right.
They're somewhat regional, that maybe
Yes.
even coming back as a unit, you have a buddy in the next city
Sure.
or closer than
Absolutely.
you would have if they're just coming from all over the United States, replacing one by one.
No, these are units
into
that,
units.
that the soldiers have been together for several years.
And
go
Jimmy,
to-
what do you think brought on the intense unpopularity of this war?
Well, I blame it on the culture of the time back through the mid to late 60s, the hippie movements, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and I love rock and roll, but the others can go away
Yeah.
anytime now.
Sex can go away. Are you married?
Well, I'm sorry about that.
That was a mistake.
That
okay.
was a mistake. Free sex.
Okay, right. The hippie type.
The hippie
yeah.
type.
Yes. And we talked about a little bit on break about some of this too, where it was just a rebellious time in our society. They rebelled.
Right.
They wanted to rebel.
There was anybody with any authority they despised, and taking over the administration building at the college that I was going to, for why, I don't know, just because they didn't want, that was a position of authority that they wanted to tear down, I guess.
So when you were actually in Vietnam in active service, you were hearing all this information came to you, all
sure.
of the protests. You
Sure.
were made aware of those. So,
Oh, yes.
So you said it once during our break that this was part of why you even chose to stay in the military. Tell us
Absolutely.
about that.
Well, when I came back, I didn't like the civilian world. I didn't like, it was the same as what it was when I was in college. And so I decided to stay in. It was very comfortable, living on a military installation with all your fellow soldiers, and so the civilian world was pushed off to the side, let's say, and so you stayed where you were comfortable.
Right. So instead of going out into the civilian world where you were branded for having supported an unpopular war, you stayed in the military where you didn't have that kind of dissent coming at
Right.
you it almost felt personal, didn't it?
At times, yes. At times, yes. It eventually faded away through the 70s and 80s.
Did people ever say anything to you personally attacking you that you can remember? I bet it's a memory you still have.
Yeah, there's a couple of things in there that where people had said stuff to me, and when I was stationed in Europe, Germany, German friends of mine were asking why I supported that war, and I don't remember what I said to them, but I can remember them questioning me about that.
And what options did you have? You went ahead and signed up because you wanted to be in the helicopter pilot program instead of taken who knows where when the very next day you were drafted.
Right.
So I was just mostly asking, where you were actually drafted to sign up, how that affected, the fact that people understand that? Didn't they look at the fact that it wasn't actually a choice necessarily? This was a government decision?
There were a lot of people that were drafted, that's for sure, but there were still patriotic people too that enlisted to go. My brother was one. He didn't get drafted. He enlisted to go into the service.
I'm very glad you brought that up, Jimmy, because, we're talking about the draft only affected men at the time, but certainly there were many women serving, but also many very patriotic people that wanted to support their country. This wasn't their personal decision, but this was the country's decision to take on this conflict. And just as we had very patriotic people today doing that, they were also there, but they just weren't maybe appreciated as much. So
True.
So let me tell you, let me throw out a dirty word. You know where I'm going, Jane Fonda. When I called Jimmy about this interview, I had mentioned something about another guest that had had some interaction with her, not even thinking, my goodness, tell us about this dirty word, Jane Fonda, which she was in your day.
When I was in Vietnam, she was in North Vietnam protesting the war and saying a lot of bad things about even our POWs over there were traitors to their country for being involved in the war. And
did that get back to them, the POWs, the prisoner of war?
I don't know. I would imagine it did, yes.
And they're being called a traitor sitting
Right.
in those circumstances. Right. That's one reason I really admired John McCain. We don't have
Right.
all of our commanders-in-chief who've had active military service.
Right.
And you've heard his story as a POW.
Sure. I have a brother-in-law that was POW for the latter part of the war as an Air Force pilot, shot down.
Did he talk about his experience?
Not much at all.
Not much at all. And we respect that.
And I have several Army friends that were POWs also during the war.
Do you understand the conditions to maybe be more horrific than we want to think about? Or
Oh, sure.
Absolutely. And I'm sure a lot of that doesn't even necessarily get back to the media, certainly not to Jane Fonda, my goodness. I mean, so is there anything, as we're kind of coming to a close, Jimmy, that life lessons that you've learned, you have a son in active duty military right now,
Right.
Life lessons for this?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is it gave me a career in the Army that I really enjoyed. And then as a helicopter pilot, air ambulance helicopter pilot in Omaha for 8 years before I started teaching here in Salina. And I wouldn't be where I am if I hadn't chosen to go into the service as a pilot. And I think they trained me pretty well. And life's lessons, study hard and get good grades, I guess.
Right. Well, that's a good thing to end on. And thank you so much, Jimmy, for coming in here to talk with me in honor of this Veterans Day. And thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.
We can certainly stand beside you today, even though maybe they didn't back then. So this is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show, 910 KINA Salina. Again, stay tuned for our next guest. You'll want to hear that. This is Joan at 910 KINA. A big thanks to my listeners for staying tuned in to the Joan Jerkovich Show here on 910 KINA. We're here with our second war veteran, and this is someone who's very distinguished, not only from his military service, but just with all of his civil service. And this is Dr. Ken Bernard. He has a huge dedication to aviation that began somewhere around 1968 with his military career as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. And I'm taking this information from, you were actually one of the Kansas Governor's Aviation Awards. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
And I also read from that bio, and I'm going to go ahead and put this out, that among some of your military awards are the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star, and the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross. And you've also had a long service in the Kansas National Guard. And then, of course, most of us here in Salina know you that since 1977, you've been involved with the aviation program at Kansas State University.
Correct.
So a lot, and then we won't even, I think I'm going to try to, before you leave here today, get into a little bit about how you've worked also with the climate project from Al Gore. So what is your PhD in? Can you tell me?
It was from Oklahoma State University, and it's in aeronautical and space studies.
Okay, very much in line with, and was that after you were back from the military, or when did that occur?
Yes, I had a sabbatical to complete my residency requirement, and that was in 1997, and I finished the degree in 98.
Well, tell me about your service in the military, because we're putting this up as a tribute to veterans.
Well, I like most Vietnam-era veterans, I was drafted. I was fooling around college, lost my deferment, and was drafted in 1968. Really didn't know what I was getting into. at the time, you had a couple options. You could go to Canada, which sounded appealing at first, but kind of ruled that out. Or you could try to get out of service by claiming you were trying to fail tests, all these things that people told you to do to, but that obviously
Did they have
really
the
didn't work.
conscientious objector program in place?
Yes, they had that, but, that was, I really wasn't one, so it was, I could have pretended to be one or whatever, but at any rate, so you just kind of got caught up with the wave and you just went with the flow like most people did. And so I went to basic training, and then I was pretty good at physical fitness and rifle marksmanship, which keyed into special forces. So they said, well, you can be a unique special forces, and that's, and well, yeah, I could do that. So I joined that, and they sent me to medical training, which that would have been my preference for the specialty. And when I finished the basic combat medical training, I thought, they kind of got you ready for the blood and gore that you're going to confront. And I wasn't too sure that was my cup of tea after all. And I had an opportunity to go to infantry OCS and then to flight school. So that was my progression. And of course, I had a commercial instrument civilian license before I was drafted, so that was a natural one.
And how old were you when you were drafted? You said
20,
college age.
I was 21.
20 or 21, that seems so young. Of course, they had to register for the young people today that don't even know so much about, they know the draft exists. You have to register at age 18.
Right.
And then how does that happen that you get drafted?
Well,
Just a lottery
it was
system?
a lottery system, and it was based on what part of country you were from and so forth. But at the time I went in, I served in Vietnam 70, 71, was drafted 68, and it was kind of the peak. So it was more not if, but when you were going to be selected.
Because the conflict actually started in 1955 and ended in April of 75. Is that even sound correct? 20 years?
Well, look at what situation we're in now.
I know. We forget that the Iraqi war is already 10 years.
Right.
The war.
So yes, it started slow and it built up over time,
and then you went into the aviation program, but you said you already had your commercial pilot's license. That had to be unique in itself. I'm surprised they tried to run you through being maybe a medical or a medic person and didn't pick up on that right away, because that's pretty specialized training. You already had your private pilot's license as a civilian?
You would think so, but you can't use logic in the military scheme of things. One story I love to tell is after Vietnam service, they said, well, one good thing about after your service, you could choose wherever you want to be assigned after Vietnam. So I thought, well, I'd like to Fort Lewis, Washington, somewhere on the West Coast. And I thought, well, instead of being specific, I'll just say anything on the West Coast. That'd be satisfying to me. And so when I got my orders, it was Fort Riley, Kansas.
Oh.
So that
we're the new West Coast, right?
Coincides with your logic, with recognizing my flight school. What that did, though, is when I went to flight school, I was way ahead of most of the other candidates because, I already knew the rules and so forth. So it made it a lot easier for me, and I, graduated right at the top of the class because of that.
But now you were taught in flight school because you were actually a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, when I first went to flight school, they said, well, you can, because of your background, you could go to fixed wing school or helicopter. And my logic, which was not very
20-year-old,
yeah,
20-year-old logic.
I thought, well, I already knew how to fly airplanes. I'll fly helicopters. What I didn't realize is what that got me into, So. Which
is what?
Well, it put me in harm's way much more so than an aircraft pilot would have been.